Thanks for joining us here on Perspectives. I'm Eli Roberts in for Tracy Alexander. The day is here. A new set of American sanctions going into effect that target Iran and companies that do business with the country. And despite the financial pressure, Iranian leaders continue to vow defiance. But while Iranians navigate the new web of sanctions, the most important decision on the issue will likely be made from far, far away. Senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman connecting the dots tonight.
Iranians trying to move forward, making their way through the morning rush hour and through a new reality. At 8:31 a.m. local time Tuesday, 12:01 a.m. in the eastern U.S., the first set of new U.S. sanctions on Iran went into effect, adding potentially to the strains of an economy already in trouble.
I'm so worried about my life, future, country. And as a young girl, I'm worried about my job. There are no job opportunities, and I'm afraid of losing my job.
Iranians have felt the pressure of sanctions before. In 2012, then-President Barack Obama toughened U.S. sanctions, which he then waived or lifted after the 2015 nuclear deal. This U.S. president has taken a different tack. Donald Trump pulling out of the nuclear deal entirely on May 8th. 91 days later, many sanctions are back. To be enforced, Trump says, not only against Americans, but against non-Americans too. The president tweeting Tuesday, anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. Europe continuing to strike a defiant note.
We are encouraging small and medium enterprises in particular to increase business with and in Iran as part of something that for us is a security priority.
Looking forward, the impact of sanctions may not be decided in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, or Tehran, but in Beijing, New Delhi, Seoul, and Tokyo. Asian countries bought at least 61% of Iran's oil in 2017. If they keep buying, that will help Iran. U.S. sanctions on oil go into effect November 5th. The Trump administration is putting pressure on Asian countries to cut back on those oil imports. So far, India and South Korea have shown signs of heeding the call. Not so in China, and Japan is wavering. Foreign capitals deciding Iran's fate, leaving Iranians contemplating their future. Owen Alterman, i24 News.
And joining us from Washington, Sina Azodi, who is an expert on Iran. And of course, here in studio with me, i24 News Senior International Affairs Correspondent Owen Alterman. Owen, I want to start with you because these renewed sanctions that the U.S. is putting in place are having an effect on European oil buys from Iran, also possibly India and South Korea. But the elephant in the room is, what about China, one? And two, who are the countries that actually buy oil from Iran?
Well, Eli, we'll start with that second part. We talked about it a little bit in the report and that huge percentage of Asian countries that buy Iranian oil. Let's take a look at what the numbers actually are. These come from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, which itself took it from another source. And as you can see, those four countries, China, India, South Korea, and Japan, buy 61% of Iranian oil. We should say bought 61%. These are numbers for 2017. And then the rest you can see in gray. So these four countries have a huge impact. And you're right. Three of the four, India, South Korea, and Japan, part of the U.S. alliance system, gives the U.S. particular political and security leverage over those countries. And at least India and South Korea have come into line, and Japan still trying to negotiate with the U.S. government. As you said, Eli, that leaves China. The Chinese have said they're not going to have any part in this, and they're going to continue to buy oil from the United States. Some of their companies and certainly some of their banks protected from U.S. sanctions. Why? They don't do business in the United States. So the usual club that the U.S. government can hold over companies and banks isn't really held over those. How could it then be used? Well, one way is that sanctions enforcers could try to go against ships, against insurers, against other targets connected to these companies. And second, it could become part of the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. Eli, I don't have to remind you, that's already a complicated relationship. These two countries either on the verge of or in a trade war. The United States also wanting China's cooperation on North Korea. There's tension in the South China Sea. This could become part of that complicated mix of issues. Again, but if the Trump administration really truly wants to prioritize this, they could take it to the finish line.
Sina, I want to bring you into the conversation right now because these renewed sanctions put in place by the Trump administration are already having an effect on the Iranian economy, and things aren't good as it is already. My question for you is, are Iran's leaders sweating this?
Absolutely, but we have to keep in mind that the sanctions that are going to affect today, or went into effect today, were pretty marginal compared to the sanctions that are supposed to come into effect on November 7th. And the other issue is that after President Trump announced that he's going to withdraw the U.S. from the deal, companies already, at the time, already started pulling out of Iran. So Iranians have already seen the effects of the deal, of Trump's withdrawal from the deal. But as I said, the important part of President Trump's decision will be November 7th, when Iran is supposed to not be able to sell its oil.
All right, so the sanctions that we are hearing about today, Sina, what kind of a real effect might they have? And making that question slightly more specific, what about the people in Iran? Because like you said, they are seeing the effects of this right now. Could it possibly challenge the regime if people are opposed to these sanctions and the effect that it's actually having on their lives?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the sanctions will affect Iranian lives. In 2011, when the sanctions went into effect initially, thousands of Iranians were laid off from Iran's auto industry. And as the sanctions are coming back again on Iran's auto industry, we should expect that more people will be laid off, and the prices will go up. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, the problem with authoritarian states is when you have a state with more resources and the people can barely afford their livings, the state will have more power vis-a-vis its people. So you're strengthening the state, you're undermining the status of people who are actually in need of food and other essentials.
Okay, Sina, thank you for that. And I want to turn the conversation back to you, Oren, here in studio, because these sanctions are going into place today. As Sina just told us, there's another round set to go in place on November 7th. Is there anything that Iran could do, theoretically, to keep the sanctions from actually going into effect?
Well, here there is a place for Washington to play a part in decision-making. Eli, President Trump has said he's willing to meet with Hassan Rouhani, reportedly has asked for meetings in the past. The two will be together, at least in the same city. For the opening of the UN General Assembly in New York in September, there could be talks, and those talks could persuade the United States to hold off on imposing new sanctions. But again, I remind you, even in the North Korea case, when Donald Trump went to Singapore to meet with Kim Jong-un, the U.S. kept and has still kept those sanctions in place to continue the pressure on North Korea, what the president had called maximum pressure. Again, the same could be in store for Iran unless there really is a sense that the sanctions should be at least held off on after that November 5th deadline. But I think that that's a long shot, even if the two go on ahead into the meeting.
Sina, I have one more question for you while we have you. What about the Strait of Hormuz? Because that is an issue that is blowing up right now. Will Iran block it? Will they not block it? What do you know? You've got 30 seconds.
Well, on the Strait of Hormuz, at this point, I see it very unlikely that Iranians will decide to even try to close the Strait of Hormuz. But we have seen repeatedly, and thanks to documents that are out, we know that when Iranians are pressured or they feel that they're cornered, they may take actions that are more aggressive. And if Iran decides, for whatever reason, to close the Strait of Hormuz, it has to take into consideration that the U.S. will act to open the Strait of Hormuz. And in fact, the former commander of IRGC
Sina, I got to leave it there. The clock is ticking. Sina, thank you for that perspective. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment.